Well, welcome back to the deep dive. We are back after a little bit of a break. We were our last episode was around Christmas time.
Around Christmas and the holidays.
Yeah, and so my name is Brad. I'm one of the teaching pastors here at Calvary, joined by Paul Utenage, who's our interim lead pastor. And over the next few weeks, what we're going to be doing is we are going to be releasing episodes that are based on the content of a Tuesday night class that we're leading.
Which is unusual because usually we do it on the basis of what we do on Sunday morning.
Yeah, so normally our deep dive episodes, as Paul said, they focus on the topic or the subject or the passage of Scripture from a Sunday morning or from the teaching series that we're doing in our weekend worship services. We're going to continue doing that. We're going to pick that back up. We've got a series over the book of James coming up that we're really excited to take some extra deep dives on. And we'll have some songs that we look at as well. But we're going to do 5 episodes on this topic that we're leading on Tuesday nights, which is social engagement. That's the title of the class. And really the crux of it is what does it look like for us as Christians to engage in social issues, to engage in society. And so we have a variety of topics that we're going to be covering.
It's really applies across the board to so much of our life because everything we do is connected to society and culture. So it's a huge topic.
Absolutely. And this year, being an election year, there's a number of topics that you might find yourself in conversations with coworkers or neighbors or family members, or as you're watching the news, reading headlines, as you're preparing to vote later in the year, you might be wrestling internally with these. So this class is not, hey, what should you think about different political issues, but it's really a how should we think? How do we develop and how do we engage? How do we be present? How do we do that in a way that's missional, in a way that's winsome, in a way that makes much of Jesus?
In fact, nor are we trying to create a political party conversation.
Absolutely.
We're not trying to create a platform for one political party versus another, unless we said we want the Kingdom Party, which I would vote for.
Absolutely.
But if we're really trying to be able to say, as a Christian, apart from whatever labels you have, apart from whatever associations you normally make, as a Christian, how are you to think about these topics?
Yeah.
And act on these topics?
So the specific topics that we are going to be discussing in future weeks are politics, abortion, environment, and immigration. So very non-controversial,
Especially this year.
topics.
In fact, actually, folks, the reality is we chose those because we know that you would be impacted by those topics, and we know that you're going to have conversations with people.
Yeah.
And so we wanted to be able to say, hey, what does the gospel say about those topics?
Yeah, and in no way are those the only topics that relate to social engagement and believers, but those are especially relevant topics right now. So in this episode, though, and in class on Tuesday, it was just kind of an intro to social engagement.
Yeah.
Paul led the class, and so what I'm going to do is just going to ask you some questions, and we're going to really go through the material that you presented, even the moments where we asked or you asked discussion questions. We're going to kind of do a little bit of that here. So maybe there's some listeners who are in the class, and they're like, oh, I really want to know actually what Paul and Brad are thinking about these things instead of just making them,
This is your chance,
ask
folks.
us.
This is your chance.
Yeah, and then just another disclaimer before we get started. I said this in the chapel during our class. I'm going to say it again right here. Our goal is not to create a fight club. It's not to create a debate hall. This is a place where we want to grow in our ability to listen and understand one another. We want to grow in our ability to understand truth that God has presented in Scripture, and where something maybe isn't clear, what can we learn from wisdom to apply timeless truth to new situations. And so that's the goal for these conversations. I will also say that this is as you said, this is not we're not talking one particular political party. We're talking about just anything and everything.
In fact, we can't do it on this deep dive.
Yeah.
But there is a interesting exercise to do, which is basically to be able to say, if Jesus was creating a political party,
Yeah.
what would the platform presentation and the platform tenets of that, what would the
Yeah.
principles of that platform would be? Because in reality, it would be completely different from any party
Yeah. Yeah.
in our country, and I'd even say probably in the world.
Yeah. And I love what we're doing in our sermon series right now too, because there's some definite parallels.
Yeah, on purpose. Yeah.
You know, the week of Jesus' death, the week that he was arrested, you know, he enters into Jerusalem, and you know they call it the triumphal entry, right? And it's a scene kind of from Zechariah, but you have all of these people who had certain expectations, like they were looking and wanting Jesus to be their political hero, their leader who was going to overthrow Rome and restore them to, you know, the place that they understood or thought they should be as God's blessed people. So there's some definite, I think, parallels that we can make when we think about politics and political agendas and this question of like, what are we looking for? What are we looking for Jesus to do?
Yeah.
And so I don't know. I mean, that's a fascinating question. Like, what would his political party be? He probably wouldn't have one because his way of influencing is.
In one sense, you could say that the kingdom is a party.
Yeah.
It's not. It's not a political party because it's the kingdom is over everything.
Yeah.
But the gospel does challenge everything, and so it shouldn't surprise us that the gospel challenges everything that our political parties, our earthly political parties, would do, whether in this country or in any other country. And so what you've got is this sense to be able to say, where does the gospel challenge that? Because it actually means that in one sense, Christians don't fit a political party if we're really trying to say, what does the Bible say, and how does the gospel challenge everything? There are parts of our earthly wisdom and knowledge by God's common grace that we would say, yeah, hey, that party touched something true, that party touched something helpful. But so did the other party, and so did another party. And it's just an interesting idea to go, what would the tenets of the platform be like at the convention for Jesus, this party?
I think we just came up with our icebreaker for next week.
That would be a great conversation, yeah.
Cool. All right, last thing, and then we'll dive into this week's topic. If you have any questions, if you have anything that you want to add, please comments, right? We have this on YouTube. There's a comment section. We have an email address, podcasts@calvary.church. We usually use that if people are looking to, hey, can you deep dive this song or this topic in the future? But feel free. Use the email address, podcast@calvary.church. Shoot us a message. Shoot us your thoughts. Give us a review, like this, share this podcast with others. I'm saying all of this before we actually have the conversation, but anyway, so that's that. All right, let's jump into the topic. So, introduction to social engagement. So, Paul, you started out with a few different kind of group questions. You know, this first one: what are some current societal and cultural issues that Christians should be actively addressing? Like, what comes to your mind when you hear that question?
Well, obviously, in this election year, you have the questions about race still are there. They're always there, but we have questions about race. And we have questions about immigration, which is one of the topics that we've chosen. We didn't choose race as a topic in this particular season, but it's well worth talking about at some point. Immigration got all kinds of issues for it. Yet you've also, for me personally, I shared, the other night, one of my Popeye moment ones that for me pop out, which is sexual traffic.
Yeah.
And it just drives me nuts to realize the horror and the damage that is being done by very violent people, and I'd say very evil people, on young girls and young women, and grabbing them into sex slavery, basically, is what it is. Well, that's one of them, obviously, close to my heart.
And that's one of the ways God works, right? He does put these specific, almost like passion projects, right, on our hearts. It's where we see throughout history different individuals who make a difference in society, right? It's because there's a particular issue that's not congruent with God's word, with God's design for human flourishing. And he raises them up to do something about it.
Even, you're asking another topic. Even economics, we're not dealing with this one, but there's questions about economics from a missional standpoint. There's questions about economics from a social, cultural engagement as Christians. So how are we to be using our money, and what public policy should come out of that? So everybody loves Dave Ramsey as to how, and others like him, Ron Blue and others, how they help us learn within our budgeting. They help us handle our personal money. But what do you do when there's a community?
Yeah.
And how is the gospel challenge how communities and governments use money? That's a wild one.
For sure. Speaking of Dave Ramsey, I saw something, last weekend was daylight savings time. So it was the clock change for spring forward. And I saw something on social media. It was, someone said, hey, I've been saving daylight in envelopes all year, so I don't need to, I don't need to change anything. Anyway, just a fun, tongue in cheek. Yeah, those are great, great examples. Some other examples, obviously, really anything that's on a political platform, even on the local level, right? We have society issues here. We have traffic laws. We have all these different ways, all these different
poverty,
forms.
school. So I was in one church where we actually adopted 3 schools that were within a basic radius of our church. And we said, we're going to go not to try to tell them how to run their school and not to try to even get into the debate with them about what curriculum and things. We just said, we're here to bless you. And what we found out was, as we did that, we ended up having a lot of opportunities to actually have conversations with people about the gospel, certainly with the kids and with the teachers as well. In fact, we even had a Sunday where we said to all 3 schools, hey, this Sunday at our church is a Teacher Appreciation Sunday. Please come join us. We have a lunch for you. If you're a teacher in one of these 3 schools, we've got a free lunch for you. And then join us with worship. And it's amazing to me how many of them actually did.
That's really cool.
And that's just a missional opportunity. How do you engage in your culture to be able to do that? Because we said for us, families and education is a common piece. And we said that's one of the areas we want to deal with.
Yeah.
So, it's only limited by our imagination because we're dealing with society and culture. Well, that's a very broad area and environment.
Around 10 years ago, I was at a conference and I heard Andy Stanley speak. Andy Stanley is a pastor of a very large church in the Atlanta, Georgia area. And he threw out a stat. So one of the topics that's really close to his heart and his wife's heart is our foster care system. And he said if one family from every church in the United States adopted a child out of the foster care system, there would be no need for the foster care system in our nation. Which is, it's
amazing.
That's amazing.
So here's where you can make it even smaller. So when I was in Cincinnati, we were at a church, and we had a number of people who were very interested in foster care and adoption. And they made this ministry, and they said their vision was to say there will not be one kid in the foster care system that's left there in the whole county, because they're going to make sure that Christians from 3 churches that all banded together for it made sure that we covered every foster care kid. Now, there were other families beyond those 3 churches that helped, and yet that was the vision for it. It was an amazing vision.
Yeah. So you asked another question on Tuesday, and that's even an example, a potential answer for this question. What are some examples of Christians in either the Bible or just throughout history who have made a difference? They've positively impacted society and culture.
So one of my favorite in the Bible is Barnabas. Barnabas certainly impacted for the gospel. He went around with Paul for a while, and actually he was involved very much with some of the other younger guys that would ultimately become great leaders in the church. There's an unknown one, which we just kind of covered in one of our Sunday services, which is really Simon of Cyrene. So we know that Simon was picked up by the Roman soldiers to be able to carry Jesus' cross. Interestingly, Mark identifies him to say this is the father of Alexander and Rufus. Well, why did he do that? Was because, the readers at that time would have said, oh, Rufus, oh, Alexander, oh, I know who that was. So apparently he was so impacted by watching Jesus at the crucifixion that he did trust Christ as his Savior, and he went on with his area to become somebody that would touch his community, his city, which is missional, which is what we're talking about. He went on to so touch that, and then raise his own family up that his sons became known around basically the civilized world where Christianity was at work. And so the gospel could actually say, by the way, this is that guy Simon who was the father of these people that you know.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not one that we think of often, but it's one that we realize had to be there. And then, of course, in history, you've got so many.
So many.
You've got the issue of slavery, you've got the issue of child, you've got the issue of education, hospitals. I mean, hospitals, basically, hospitals came from Christians establishing hospitals and starting that up in the first place. That was not the world's idea. That was Christians' idea.
Right. Yeah, a name that comes to mind, William Wilberforce, right, in England. He helped through, politics and through his influence to abolish the slave trade in England. You think about Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement here in our own country, also connected to the idea of race and human dignity. In the Bible, you see this example of Joseph. God used Joseph to, and the wisdom that he gave him and the vision that he gave him to
literally change a nation.
Literally change a nation and a whole region. Because you had nations around Egypt coming to Egypt for food. And so, so many just great examples. So on Tuesday night in the class, there were 3 kind of foundational pillars, essentially, that we're kind of using to introduce this topic. What was the first one?
Well, the first one was God's engagement in the world. I always remember it in terms of the movement of my arm. You've got, how does God engage in the world himself? Well, okay, if God engages in the world, what is the world's accountability back to God? And then in the middle of that, you've got God's people. So what is the believers? So the first one really is God's engagement to the world. And if you miss that one, you don't have anything else to stand on.
Well, and it's something we've, at Calvary over the last year and a half, really ever since you've been here, the thing that you keep heralding to us, right, is start everything with the nature of God, right? You start with God.
Start with the why.
Everything else falls from there.
Yeah. And so what you've got here is the reality of, you're looking at, because number one, because if we're created in the image of God, therefore we're going to have this inward innate desire, ability, not just compatibility, but literally ability to be able to reach out. And so you have the reality that God is by his very nature a sending God. And God is by his very nature involved in his creation. So you have all these verses and passages that says, God didn't just create and then walk away. No, God created and then keeps his hand at all times, in all ways, active. In fact, if he didn't, we would all be destroyed. We would not have the ability, the universe, the creation would not have the ability to continue. We're told even the odd one of, Jesus is the one that holds all things together. People are like, what does that mean? We're like, we're not quite sure. Certainly gravity is a part of that.
Big old mystery box that God has filled with.
And scientists have not figured that out yet. They think they get close at times, but the reality is if you start asking questions, they haven't. And so you have that he's very, very active in the world. And therefore you've got by his common grace. There's that whole issue of common grace versus special grace. The reality that God blesses all people. In fact, that was one of Paul's arguments, his apologetics arguments in Acts, that God is a God of common grace who blesses all people. Everybody have rain comes on them, Paul said, and therefore the seed comes up for everybody and everybody has food. And so you've got this reality that every aspect of culture and every aspect of society is there, and he speaks to each of them to at least to varying degrees. I mentioned economics a minute ago. He speaks to economics. He speaks to government. He speaks to politics. He speaks to all these things. And so it's not just that somehow faith is this ethereal thing up in the sky only that doesn't touch on us. Even though people have tried to distinguish between matter and spirit and try to divide it at times over history, the reality of it is God says, no, stop it. I'm very active in my creation.
And from an application standpoint, God, because he is so engaged in his world, there will be things that we might not even know what is the right way to vote on a topic or to think on a topic or to do. And that can cause fear, it can cause insecurity, it can cause anxiety. like we have to remember, hey, God is engaged. God cares about this world, and He is guiding, and He is leading, He is working. There's a great resource if you're looking to, dive even deeper. Chris Wright wrote a book called The Mission of God, and in
It's a big old thick one.
it's thick, but it's fairly it's not a
No, you can read it.
it's not a super technical read.
No.
But the idea in this book is that from the beginning of creation, God has been a missional God. I mean, that was what when he placed Adam and Eve in a garden, he gave them what they call the creational mandate. Hey, go and, have dominion on the world, but be fruitful and multiply and fill it with His kingdom of His character, because He's designed it to flourish in a particular way, but it all goes back to His nature and His identity.
Yeah. In fact, even the book of Hebrews, the Epistle of Hebrews, starts that way. It's one of those great introduction. Hebrews and John are, for me, the great introductions to the gospel story. And Hebrews starts that way, and then starts to talk about Christ, if you remember, in the first few verses. And it's all missional. Everything there is missional.
Yeah. Yes, we have a missional God. A God who is orchestrating all things. He's holding all things together. He uses people and these different structures within creation to reveal His character, to make known His character. So even things like marriage and family and governmental systems and cities and organizations of people. He's given people the ability and the responsibility to govern, and that's Him sharing His authority, and in so doing, right, He's given us this really. He allows us to participate in this mission of His.
So here's one of the things that we didn't get to talk about on Tuesday night because we ran out of time, unfortunately. I mean, this huge topic,
and this is just the introduction of it, right?
And so, if you're still thinking about God's engagement to the world, if we recognize that He's certainly active, which is really most of what we've listed here, but you've also got the nature of God itself, which means that the engagement of God into the world is therefore based on His character and on His nature. So therefore, every topic that we deal with in terms of social cultural pieces should be based somehow on the nature of God.
Yeah.
So for instance, one of the things that we mentioned later on Tuesday night was politics. In fact, it was even a question that was asked about the issue of politics on this. And government, that the government has been designed by God, not just, as we all talk about, not just to reward those who are righteous and punish those who are unrighteous, but the issue, because it's God's nature engaging in the world, means that at the bottom of every political topic, bottom of every political conversation, we as Christians ought to constantly be drawing it back to justice and mercy, because that's God's peace. And so whatever the political topic is, we ought to be thinking in the back of our heads to say, hey, in this conversation, how can I get this actually be drawn to, okay, so what is justice and what is mercy?
Yeah.
Which means if you apply that as Christians to public policy, it means we're asking of our leaders, we're asking of them to think through public policy that is also based on justice and mercy as we understand it from God, because that is the character of God.
Yeah.
Take that to Washington, D.C., and boy, that's going to literally change Washington, D.C. Again, the gospel challenges everything on this.
Absolutely. Well, let's move into the second then pillar, the world's accountability.
The world's accountability to God. Most people don't really like to think about this too much because the world doesn't like that.
For sure.
Number one, the world does not want to be able to say, hey, we believe that we are accountable to God. In fact, there's always pushback on this, which is why what we talked about really was more from an apologetics side than anything else. You've actually had more involvement with Dr. Jerram Bars.
Yeah.
And I think I remember you said you loved everything.
Oh, anything that man wrote, did, said. Yeah. Any class that he taught, I'm signing up for.
He's got some fantastic stuff on natural law and moral law, and being able to say, is it okay for us as Christians to, in our conversations with non-Christians about social engagement, is it okay for us to be able to say, look, one of the reasons that we do believe that we should do X, Y, or Z in our society or in our public policies is because we believe that there is a natural law that God has established. There is a moral law that God has established, and that law was not limited to just Israel and it wasn't limited to just the church. It was for all people, which is why you have Amos, you have a lot of the books of the Old Testament that talk about all the nations where God says, I'm going to deal with this, I'm going to judge these things. You've got Jesus talking about that and the judgments of all the nations as well. And so it really tells us that's okay for us to talk about that. Now, we need to then back it up with our apologetics, be able to explain, hey, well, let me explain why that makes sense to you even as a non-Christian, because it is the most reasonable piece to be able to say that. In fact, that's one of the main arguments for Christians for the existence of God and for all the things that we have with the gospel. And so what we've got is this whole aspect of being able to fall back on that and knowing that everybody's always going to say, why should I do what the Bible says? Why should I listen to you for that? And that gets us opening with questions, be able to say, well, let's look at the rest of your life outside of this debate right here, because the rest of your life actually proves exactly what I'm saying to you.
Yeah.
Because nobody wants to live without the natural law of judgment, of accountability, without the natural law of love, even though people may say, well, it all comes from evolutionary processes. People just learn that this is the best way over the eons to do it. And that doesn't fit. It's not reasonable.
Yeah, I think about Paul, the argument he makes in Romans where he says, that God has, written his law essentially on the hearts of humans. And he, I had a professor in seminary who, he loved this line. He says, well, two things. He says, one, God doesn't make junk. And two, God, if God is God, then he reserves the right to design a system in a way that's going to lead to the flourishing of those in the system. That's what he's done. He's created a design. And so for us, as we're not at the point yet for believers, but for humans, we should be keenly interested in, okay, how has God designed a system that's going to ultimately promote and lead to the flourishing of people. And so this question of, well, should we design governments or secular society around God's moral law and around his natural law? We should. Because if he's God,
we should.
He knows what he's doing.
And I and many others, not just me, I would argue, and we have. So there are values that are common to every people group at all ages. I think I mentioned that there's a recently reading, and the article was really about we're literally born, literally in the womb. We have these certain values that come out, and the babies have these immediate recognition of certain values. So we actually have, and not definitely in Judeo-Christian histories and societies, but even in the other societies that don't have any Judeo-Christian background in them, there are these basic values that people have also. So not only should we, but we have. And that's always my point with non-Christians, because I want them to understand, look, if we're not in a debate about this, you and I both affirm the same things.
Yeah.
In fact, you're actually constantly wanting something from other people on the basis of these things. And so where does that come from? And so that really is humanity's accountability to God for these things. And again, that's why I said if you don't have the God's engagement in the world, the rest of it falls apart. But with God's engagement in the world, with humanity responding now almost intuitively, whether they know it or not, or whether they like it or not, we recognize this, okay, there's some things that we ought to be thinking about for our engagement within society and culture.
Yeah, that's great. So we've talked about God's engagement in the world. We've talked about the world's accountability to God. Then that third pillar, the Christian or the believer's engagement in the world. So in light of those two truths, what does it actually look like for those who are following Jesus? What are some principles that we can take to help us enter in and engage in this world.
Well, one of the ones that we had on Tuesday night, folks, that somebody said from their table talk, one of the early ones, they said, it just means that we need to get engaged. We need to be where people are and enter into their worlds. That you can't be missional, you can't be engaged in society if you're not actually there with them and listening and asking questions and looking for those needs that God plops right in front of us. Because I do think God gives us way many more missional opportunities than we're ever aware of.
Yeah.
And so if we're actively attuned to that and actively engaged and thrown into that, I heard one missional leader was basically said, you penetrate into the society, and as you penetrate into the society, like digging for oil, you suddenly find all of these layers of soil underneath. And that's certainly probably the first one.
It's great, right?
Jesus, just get out there.
Well, and Jesus, he has sent us into the world. I mean, even that Great Commission is this reminder of, hey, as you go, like, make disciples. Well, how do you do that? Well, you have to know people. You have to be in relationship. This is something that's particularly convicting for me and Paul. I know you've throughout your ministry career, like you've done a really good job of, I think, creating connections with people outside the church. But like, I work in a church surrounded by Christians. And so I have to be very intentional at the way I form relationships with my neighbors, with people at the coffee shop that I go to regularly. Because if I don't, then all I'm doing is talking to Christians every day. And so that's one very simple way. The other thing that comes to mind, I had a professor again in seminary. It was a movie class. It was a kind of a culture apologetics, and it was about movies.
Great class.
It was awesome. And this professor, who was a visiting professor, his name was Dennis Hack. He loves movies. He loves going to movies because he says, hey, films they're a mirror into ourselves and our own story, but they're also a window into culture. What are the things that culture and society around me is concerned about? Well, those themes show up in movies. And so he'd go to the movie theater and he'd talk to the attendant at the counter and say, hey, what movie are you liking? And, they would share a movie that he probably would never have seen. And this isn't hey, go to the movie theater and see any and every movie. Like, everyone has different levels of consciousness on, like, what, is appropriate and what they should. But he would go and see movies that were recommended by the people who work at the movie theater for the sole purpose of being able to go and then have a conversation like, hey, what did you like about that movie? I really liked the way that these two people, like, did friendship. And then he was able to have conversations over time around, hey, who else is like, God's a relational God. Like, we have friendships with one another because God has a relationship within himself and he extends that to us. And so that's just one.
And see, that's a great example of that whole why and what piece at a micro level.
Yeah.
If you just ask the question why, so in that case you could say, so why is that so important for you?
Yeah.
Well, inevitably, again, natural law, moral law, created in the image of God, again, inevitably, they're going to say something that the gospel will grab onto, even though it will also challenge what they think their interpretation of that is. And those are phenomenal conversations.
Oh, so good.
Yeah, another principle basically is to say, okay, if this is really true, then don't beat yourself up about being concerned about certain things that God puts on your mind for our society. Now, there's another principle, though, of course, that says don't throw yourself in as if you were exactly like the world around you as to how they deal with that principle. But there are some things. So we were talking earlier about things that matter to us, And I would love it if every member and regular attender at Calvary could literally, if we could say to them, okay, on one side of a napkin, can you share the gospel with somebody? Then turn the napkin over and now talk about what that does in your life and where it is that God is directing you in this world that matters. And as soon as we say that aspect that matters, we are connecting into so many generations now that that's actually where they want to start.
Yeah.
They don't want to start with the objective stuff. They don't
Yeah.
want to start with what we would say is truth. They want to start with saying, well, what's something that matters? What is influencing the world that gets me beyond? I would say, well, why is that important to you? And then they would give their answer and say, you know what, the reality is that actually you're saying the exact same thing about what God says.
Yeah.
So if there's something that everybody could say, like mine, I could say it's sex trafficking and then a couple others, but mostly sex trafficking. That's my top number one. What is that? Imagine having a church of 1,000 people. If everybody was here on one same Sunday, imagine having a church of 1,000 people where every one of them would say, here's the area where as a Christian I engage to some level and to some degree at least. They don't have to run for office, but here's where I get engaged in that. And if a number of them said, and here's where we're all together, like a lot of us are concerned about the schools and the kids that are without care and needy of food and poverty and all, whatever, then they band together and suddenly now you got ministries that literally God has created by networking our own folks in that. That to me would be ideal.
Yeah.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah. What I'm hearing you say there is a couple things. I mean, the whole napkin illustration. Can you articulate the truth of the gospel? And I also want to say that the gospel is for others. It is to be shared. But I think there's a temptation when it comes to society to make like society this the opposition, well, society around me. Society is them. Society is my neighbor who doesn't know Jesus. And it's like, well, no, actually, you and I are part of society too. And so anytime we let the gospel, the good news of Jesus, do its work in us to transform us into Christ's likeness, we're actually transforming society.
That's
like
right.
we are engaged in society because gospel is working in us and changing us, and we're part of the society too.
Yeah, there used to be a group back when I was younger. There used to be a group that really said no. The philosophical stance of the church should be isolation. And my point with that was, again, you may say that in the debate, but the reality is that's not realistic, because as soon as you receive something, anything from your community around you, you're part of that society. You're part of that culture. And so you are, what you just said, we are part of that. And so what is it that we're doing with that? You know, another principle that we talked about Tuesday night was of how we go about that. The Bible is very clear that we go about that with a winsomeness. We go about that with grace. We go about that with respect. We go about that with dignity, because that also wins an open opportunity for us to be able to do that. You know, if we want to step in, let's take sex trafficking. There's no sex trafficking group that works to get people out of that slavery. If you walk in and just said, I have my idea, and here's what I want to do, and I think they're not going to ask you to volunteer because of the way you're doing it. And in fact, some of the young women wouldn't want even to have a relationship with somebody like that, because you're simply modeling what has already been done to them through all this terrible behavior. And so they're going to kind of push back and away from you. So there really is a way that we need to do that in all social engagement, in all cultural engagements, and I think is so important, and I think it's becoming more and more important in our world.
Yeah. We talked at our table about the idea of prayer, right? That's another way that we
It's another way to engage,
right, is through prayer. Simply praying for people around us, praying for those who are in leadership, praying through the different proposals or things that are going to impact society as well.
I did a case study of a church up in the Minneapolis area a number of years ago who was very missional in terms of business and prayer. And so their ministry was, they had a group of people that would say they would go into a certain number of companies, they'd go in, they'd talk to the boss or either the department chair or whatever it would be, somebody with some authority. And they say, look, we're not here. We just want to bless your company. We're from so-and-so church, and we would love to know that we can bless your company by praying for your company. Your company matters to us, which blows the business person's mind
right.
to go, there's a church that's praying for my success and my profit,
Yeah.
in my business, in my company. Yes, we are. We'd love to be able to come in and just pray for you at some point in a staff meeting or something like that. We don't want to tell you how to do it. We don't want to. We're not. But if you're open to it, we're here and we would love to do it. But otherwise, we at least want you to know that this week we're actually praying for your company because we believe that your company matters and that God is. And now they get in. So they get the gospel. Because we believe that God is interested in your company. We believe that God is interested in everybody that works for your company. And they literally would try to do 2 or 3 companies every week.
Wow.
And
That's
you
cool.
would think that most companies and most offices would not allow that to happen, where they'd say,
Sure.
oh, yeah, right,
No, people are usually pretty willing to be prayed
It's
for.
amazing how many people said, if that's all you want to do, we would be glad for you to come in, or at least with our leaders, come meet with us. And they said, we'll bring you some coffee or food with it, and we just want to pray for you, and then we'll get out of your hair.
Yeah.
It's amazing how many of
That's
those
really cool.
companies did, which then meant those folks are thinking in terms of, I just heard that God cares about the place where I work. He cares about what I'm doing. He cares about me. And here's a group of people who are living that out.
Yeah.
And if they ever decide that they want to go to church or they want to get some help from somebody, I guarantee you where they're going to go.
That's really cool.
Because they've seen that the gospel and God is interested first.
Yeah.
I thought it was fascinating
that's
what
really
they
cool.
did. Yeah, it was just right outside the Minneapolis area.
So that reminds me, as a pastor in the area, we have, I've been invited to go and to do the invocation to pray for the St. Peter's alderman meeting. It's a local municipality. Actually, earlier this week, I prayed at the St. Charles County Community Council for their meeting. It's a great opportunity. I show up, you pray, right? You start the meeting, everyone stands, you pray, and then your part is done. And it's such a cool opportunity, a unique opportunity, because not only do I get to represent our church and maybe let people know that, hey, our church is here, but I get to pray for people. And I choose to pray things like, asking for, discernment and wisdom and energy, that even through the mundane task of talking through different city codes or planning projects, that the vulnerable, right, in our community would be remembered and would be helped. And it's just such a very tangible way to be engaged in the society. Yeah. There's a question that was thrown out, because another way, one of the other things you talked about on Tuesday as a way of engaging society is submitting to civil governments.
Yeah.
And I think someone raised the question of, well, what happens if if the civil government is, trying to lead you, or is not conscious, they're not being accountable to God's moral and natural law. Like, what do we do? And I think a good example is Daniel.
In the Bible, a good example is Daniel. You've got others. You mentioned MLK, actually, earlier. Whatever anybody thinks of MLK's politics, it's almost impossible to question his faith and how that was informing what he was trying to do and driving what he was trying to do. And so, there's times when you have to. In fact, we even talked. I said, be careful about your vulnerability, not just your identification, but your vulnerability to some of the things in society as you are engaging, which was Daniel. Very, very careful about his vulnerability to an evil culture that he was in. But then also having to say, at times, you have to say, I won't do that.
Yep.
So, and I think Christians, the more we get engaged in society, the more we will have to ask those questions to be able to say, okay, I'm going to go this far, I'm going to help this need, but I'm not going to then jump the tracks to get so connected with something else. I'm going to stay on my track because I don't want to go that way, or I need to do something absolutely opposite of that. Yeah. There's always the question in the future of will our Western society, our American society here specifically, will we have to face that more and
Mhm.
more and more? I happen to believe that we will have to face that
Mhm.
more and more. I think Jesus already forewarned us that, as
Mhm.
you and I both studied the scriptures.
Mhm.
I think he told us we're going to have to.
Mhm.
And as values change in our Western society, more and more that we will. And so we'll have to face that. And sometimes we have to be willing to take the consequences of that.
Yeah. Cool. Paul, is there anything else that you wanted to highlight or hit on from Tuesday night?
So I know one of the other things we talked about on Tuesday night was the idea of Christian nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
And we tried to make it very clear that a Christian social engagement is not to be connected with any particular label, because the gospel, again, challenges every label.
Mm-hmm.
It challenges every party. And so what we don't want to do is identify the gospel. We never, ever
Mm-hmm.
want to identify the gospel with any particular one party,
Yep.
as if somehow the gospel is only connected with Republicans and the gospel is only connected with Democrats. I don't really hear that from non-Christians. I hear that from Christians, unfortunately,
Yeah.
on both sides, or even some in the middle,
Mm-hmm.
actually, that are
Mm-hmm.
that are a little bit more libertarian or independent. But we want to be very careful to realize that when the Holy Spirit came on the day of Pentecost, he filled people from all these multiple nations and cultures. And he did not say, by the way, I'm only going to fill it in this one person's culture, and then
Mm-hmm.
the rest of you have to become like this culture,
Yes.
as well as accept Jesus, because the gospel challenges every human culture and every human party.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have to be really careful to not do that. That does not mean that we are not patriotic.
Yeah.
That does not mean that we walk away from loyalty to our nation. I still love supporting the United States in the Olympics.
Mm-hmm.
I still get tears in my eyes, depending upon how well the song is sung
Mm-hmm.
at a sports arena at times.
Well, maybe you
So
get tears in
I
your
get
eyes
make
if it's
from the
not sung
opposite
well.
if it's
Yeah.
not sung well.
Yeah.
But that does not mean that. In
Yeah.
fact, actually, Christians should be known, submit to your government, submit, and that's
Mm-hmm.
written not just to a government that is righteous, it's to every government. It was the Roman government
Mm-hmm.
that Paul wrote that to.
Yeah, and when we
And we
hit
ought to know that.
particular issues, I think of immigration for
Mm-hmm.
one. This is a fantastic example, and we'll talk about this in a few weeks, of the tension that we have to feel around this, because we're both to care, right, for the sojourner. Leviticus shares that. We're to care for anyone who is in a situation where they're fleeing hardship, but we also have to be very wise about how do we do that efficiently and in a way that protects those around us too.
Yeah.
So it's like it's a both and. It's a very
Protect
difficult-
them, protect us, protect
Yeah.
others. And I don't mean that all immigrants. In fact, I actually have that topic. I'm the one doing that topic in this series. It does not mean that we should assume that all immigrants are evil. That's wrong. That's just wrong.
Mhm.
But it's all of that. It all comes into this.
Yeah.
And so we have to realize we have to be very careful to not ever try to say that the gospel is connected with one nation
Yep.
or with one party within a nation.
Yeah.
Anytime you put another label on it, if you put an adjective in front of the word gospel,
Mm-hmm.
you're off.
Yep.
You're just off. You can't say Republican gospel. You can't say Democratic gospel. You can't say American gospel. You're off.
Mm-hmm.
Those are all adjectives that should never be connected to the gospel.
Yeah. Cool. Well, Paul, thanks for this discussion.
Oh, yeah.
It's a great starting point, I think, for the future weeks when we are going to hit some specific topics. And we're probably not going to do that perfectly.
We will. I guarantee, folks, we will not.
So this next week we're going to be talking about politics, and that's also it's an intro week of sorts as well, because there's just so many things that we so many different directions we can go with it.
In fact, we're talking about our actions with each topic, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One of the things I ended class with on Tuesday was just a very tangible exercise that each and every one of us can do. There's different ways to think about politics. There's different ways to associate with politics because of how our society and human nature just operates, we tend to polarize. And so we see that in the United States with two main parties. And chances are, as you're listening to this, you probably fit into one or the other most often. And then there's those who are apolitical. There's those who are independent or third party as well. But the challenge I gave was there's a place that you probably go to find your news, whether it's cable news, whether it's headlines, whether it's right. If you're if you lean conservative, you're probably watching Fox News or some other conservative news outlet. If you lean more to the liberal side, you're probably looking at CSNBC or CNN or some of the other more liberal-leaning news sources. Or if you're an independent or a moderate, you have yours that you're looking for too. The question I wanted to ask and the challenge that I gave the class the other night was, hey, this week, just turn on the TV and go to a news channel that represents, maybe a political party or political agenda that you don't typically line up with. So if you tend to watch Fox News, maybe turn on CNN or MSNBC. If you're, vice versa. And rather than, it might make you feel some things, might make you frustrated or angry. First thing I want you to do is name, hey, what are you feeling when you hear that? Like, what's the emotion? What's going on inside you? What's going on in your head? What's going on in your heart? And then secondly, rather than, begin to attack whatever agenda or spin you feel like is being placed, can you get to a point where you just ask yourself a question? What is this individual trying to communicate? What problem are they trying to solve? What's the good in what they're doing? Because I do think we're going to talk about this next week. By and large, I want to assume good in others. And I do think that, especially when we see in the political arena, you have two different groups who are trying to solve the same problem and going about it in different ways. So anyway, that's the homework. Can you do that? And we're going to talk about that a little bit in class this coming week. And if you're not in the class, or maybe you're watching this or listening to this after the fact or a couple months from now, maybe that's just a good reflection exercise for you to do. I'd love to hear how it goes. Again, you can email us at podcast@calvary.church, or you can comment on our YouTube video as well. Paul, thank you again for this conversation. Sure. Looking forward to the next 4 weeks as we tackle some different controversial but very important topics as they relate to our society and as they relate to the gospel, the good news, the grace of Jesus that we believe in and that we live by. Hopefully these conversations are charitable. That's one of our goals. We want them to be winsome, which means we want to be able to win people, right, for Jesus, even through the posture and the attitudes that we adopt and the way that we talk about these issues. But ultimately in everything, we want it to glorify Jesus. So thank you for listening to this episode of The Deep Dive. As we say, keep your Bibles open. Let's be curious about Scripture and about God's heart for our nations. You can find this podcast and anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can find this podcast as well as other resources on our website, calvary.church/resources. And we look forward to being together again next week. Go in grace and peace.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive, a Calvary Church Media Productions podcast. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts.